I was 9 years old the first time I realized that my neighborhood was different from the ones I saw on TV. The streets in the shows were wide and clean. The houses had big green lawns. The kids rode bikes without looking over their shoulders. But where I lived, the sidewalks had cracks, the streetlights flickered, and the playground had more broken swings than ones you could actually sit on. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just home. But then I started noticing the way my school was different too. The textbooks were old, the pages torn at the edges. The walls in the hallways had peeling paint. Sometimes we didn't have enough desks, so some kids had to sit on the floor while the teacher spoke. One day I asked my mom why our school didn't look like the one in the next town over. I had seen it when we drove past. Big windows, new books, a playground that actually looked fun. She sighed, stroked my hair, and said, "Some schools just get more money, baby." I didn't understand what that meant, not yet, but I would soon. By the time I was 12, I started noticing other things, like how the stores in our neighborhood had bars on the windows, like how the grocery store near us didn't have as much fresh food as the ones we had to drive across town to, like how the police always seemed to be around but never when you actually needed them. Then I learned the word for it, redlining. I heard my uncle say it at a family barbecue, talking to my dad about how they wouldn't give him a loan to buy a house in a better neighborhood, about how the bank kept telling him his credit wasn't good enough, but somehow his white coworker with the same job, the same income, got approved easily. That was when I started putting the pieces together. That was when I realized that the world wasn't just unfair because life was unfair. It was unfair on purpose. By the time I was 16, I had seen enough to know how things worked. I had seen my friend get arrested for walking home too late. I had seen my cousin pulled over just because his car was too nice. I had seen my teachers shake their heads when we asked why we didn't have AP classes like the schools on the other side of town. But then one day, I saw it up close. It was my senior year. I had worked hard to keep my grades up, applied to as many scholarships as I could, because I knew college was expensive, but I also knew I wanted more for myself. I got accepted into a good school, a mostly white school, a school where I would be one of the few like me, but I was ready, or at least I thought I was. The first week of classes, I walked into my economics lecture and the professor looked at me, then at the roster, then back at me. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" I nodded, trying not to let my face show anything, but inside my stomach twisted. That was the first time, but it wasn't the last. When I spoke in class, sometimes people acted surprised, like they hadn't expected me to know the answers when we had group projects. I noticed how my ideas were ignored until someone else repeated them when I walked across campus at night. Sometimes security would slow down their patrol cars, watching me just a little too closely. But the worst part wasn't any of that. The worst part was when I started doubting myself, wondering if I really did belong here, wondering if maybe they were right. Then one day in my second year, something happened that I would never forget. I was walking back to my dorm late at night, my backpack slung over one shoulder, when I saw the flashing lights before I even knew what was happening. An officer stepped out, hand on his holster. "Where are you headed?" I swallowed the tightness in my throat. "My dorm," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Got ID?" I reached into my pocket slow, just like I had been taught since I was a kid. Handed it to him. He looked at it, then at me, then back at it. "We got a call about someone suspicious in the area." I nodded but didn't say anything because what was there to say? He held on to my ID for a moment too long, then finally handed it back. "Stay out of trouble." I walked away without looking back, but my hands were shaking. The next day I told one of my classmates about it, a white guy who sat next to me in history, his face twisted with confusion. Why would they stop you if you didn't do anything wrong? I didn't have an answer for him, but that was the moment I realized that we lived in different worlds. I graduated with honors, but even at the ceremony I felt it the weight of being one of the few, the looks that lingered just a second too long. When I started my first job, a corporate office in the city, I thought maybe things would be different, but racism doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. My first week I walked into a meeting and someone asked me to grab coffee, assuming I was an assistant instead of the analyst presenting the report. When I corrected them, they laughed awkwardly, muttered something about an honest mistake, but I knew the truth. I worked twice as hard, stayed twice as late, made sure my work was flawless, but it never stopped the assumptions, the pauses before saying my name, the way I was passed over for promotions while others with less experience got ahead. Then one day, it all boiled over. A senior executive made a joke at a company dinner, something about diversity hires, something about people like me getting handouts. Everyone laughed. I didn't. The next morning I wrote about it, an article about everything I had seen, everything I had lived through. I sent it to a publication that had been reaching out to me for months, asking for my perspective. It went viral within hours. Some people reached out to thank me for saying what they had been afraid to say. Others told me I was making things up, that I was playing the victim, that racism wasn't real anymore. That night I sat in my apartment staring at the emails, the messages, the comments, and I thought about my mother, about my uncle, about the security guard in the sneaker store, about the officer who told me to stay out of trouble, about the professor who asked if I was in the right class, about the company that called me a diversity hire, and I knew that no matter how many degrees I had, no matter how successful I became, they would always try to make me feel like I didn't belong. But I did, and I wasn't going to let them forget it. I used to believe that success would be my shield, that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself over and over again, the world would have no choice but to respect me. But I was wrong. Success does not protect you from racism. It only makes the target on your back more visible. It started with an award, one I had earned through years of hard work, late nights, early mornings, endless sacrifices. I had outperformed my colleagues, met every impossible deadline, delivered results that no one else could. I was the best at what I did, and people knew it. When my name was announced at the annual company gala, there was a brief pause before the applause, a hesitation, a moment where I could feel the weight of eyes on me before the claps began. Polite, distant, restrained. I walked up to accept the award, smiling, shaking hands, but I saw it the way some of my coworkers exchanged glances, the way the executives nodded stiffly, like they had expected someone else's name to be called. The next morning, the whispers started. They just gave it to him because of diversity. I overheard it in the break room, in the hallway, in conversations that stopped when I walked by. I had earned that award, but to them I had been given it. I told myself to ignore it, to focus on the work, but racism does not let you ignore it for long. A few weeks later, I was assigned to lead a major project, the kind that could launch my career to the next level. I was excited, ready, but at the first team meeting, I noticed something strange. My colleagues kept looking to my second in command, a white man, as if waiting for him to speak, as if I wasn't the one in charge. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then, during a heated discussion about strategy, one of them turned to him directly and said, "What do you think we should do?" There was a long silence as he glanced at me, then back at them. I cleared my throat. "Actually, I'll be making the final decisions on this project." The air in the room shifted slightly, discomfort rippling beneath the surface. "Oh, of course, just making sure we're all on the same page." We weren't. As the project progressed, I noticed that emails were sent to him instead of me. Questions were directed at him instead of me. When I corrected people, they nodded, but continued as if nothing had changed. Then, one afternoon, I walked into the office and found him in the conference room with two other executives reviewing my project without me. When I stepped inside, their conversation stopped. Abruptly, he glanced at me, eyes flickering with something that looked like guilt. "Sorry, we were just getting a head start on a few things." A head start on my work. I felt my hands clench at my sides, but I forced myself to smile. "No problem, just make sure I'm looped in going forward." That night I sat at my desk, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. I had spent years proving myself, and yet I was still invisible when it mattered most. But the final straw came a week later when I was called into my boss's office. He started with praise. "We appreciate your contributions, we value your leadership," but then came the pivot. "We've decided to make some structural changes. We think the project would benefit from a co-leadership model." Co-leadership? They were taking half of my authority and giving it to someone else, someone who hadn't done the work, someone they were more comfortable following. I sat there staring at my boss, his carefully neutral expression, waiting for me to nod, to accept it, to thank him for the opportunity. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned forward, my voice steady. "Is there something about my leadership that's been inadequate?" His lips parted slightly, caught off guard. "Well, no, of course not. We just want to ensure the best possible outcome." "So you're saying the best possible outcome requires reducing my authority?" A pause, an uncomfortable shifting in his chair. It's just a matter of perception, you understand, how these things can be." Yes, I understood perfectly. That night I made a decision. I packed up my office, wrote a resignation email, and left without looking back. The next morning I sent another email, but this one wasn't to my boss. It was to a journalist who had been asking me for months to speak about the realities of corporate America as a black professional. I told her everything. The article went live 2 days later. The headline, sharp and unforgiving. It spread fast. People shared it, reposted it, debated it. My inbox flooded with messages, some supportive, some angry, some telling me I was overreacting, that I was playing the victim. But I wasn't the only one who had been through it, and I wasn't the only one who had stayed silent. A week after the article dropped, I got a message from an old colleague, a black woman who had left the company years before. "I went through the same thing," she wrote. "Thank you for saying it out loud." I sat there staring at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, before I typed back, "I'm done being silent." And I meant it. Terrence Carter hadn't been back to Willowbrook in 15 years. The town looked the same, with its old brick buildings and cobblestone streets, the trees still golden with autumn, the people still smiling as if nothing had ever been wrong. But the air smelled different to him now. He had once thought of this place as home, but now every corner carried the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. He pulled his truck into the town's community center parking lot, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He still didn't know why he had come back. The invitation had been sitting in his mailbox for a month before he finally decided. 50 years of service. Willowbrook Fire Department Anniversary Banquet. Handwritten, formal, signed by Chief Warren Gallagher himself. That name alone made his stomach twist. He remembered the fire station, the brick facade, the rows of gleaming red trucks, the crisp scent of smoke and sweat, and the silence, the cold, suffocating silence of men who had let him burn. When he walked inside, the smell of old wood and coffee filled his nose. Voices echoed in the banquet hall, glasses clinking, laughter rolling through the space. These were the same men he had once stood beside, the same ones who had called him brother, until he became something other. He had been the first black firefighter in Willowbrook, and the last. The whispers had started on his first day. Small things at first, the way people looked at him when they thought he wasn't watching, the jokes muttered under their breath, the way his locker was moved 3 times in the first month. Then came the silent treatment, the accidental equipment failures, the way they let him run into burning buildings alone while they hung back just a second too long. And then the fire. A house on the west side of town, flames licking the walls like hungry fingers. Terrence had been the first one inside. There were children screaming upstairs. His heart had pounded as he grabbed the hose, called for backup. No one came. He turned, expecting to see his team behind him, but they weren't there. The flames crackled louder, the smoke thickened. Terrence forced himself up the stairs, his lungs screaming, his vision blurring. He reached a bedroom door, kicked it open, and then the ceiling collapsed. He woke up in a hospital bed. They told him it was a tragic accident, that the fire had been too strong, that the house couldn't be saved. But he knew the truth. He saw it in their faces when they visited him, in the way they couldn't quite look him in the eye. They had let him go in alone. They had let those people die. And now, Chief Warren Gallagher wanted to honor him. The room quieted as Gallagher stepped up to the microphone, his voice rich and smooth, polished like an old politician's. Tonight, we celebrate 50 years of service, 50 years of bravery, 50 years of men willing to put their lives on the line for Willowbrook. Applause. Gallagher smiled. And we have a special guest tonight, a man who paved the way for future generations, a man whose sacrifice made our department stronger. Terrence Carter, would you join me? The applause was polite, but the eyes watching him weren't. Terrence stood slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He walked to the stage, past men who had once called him brother, past men who had once turned their backs. Gallagher extended his hand. Terrence didn't take it. Instead, he turned to the crowd, and he told them the truth. He told them about the fire, about how he had gone in alone, about how he had screamed for help while the others waited outside. He told them about the family that died that night, a mother, a father, 2 children, trapped because the men outside had refused to follow him in. He told them how his own brothers had let him burn. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, faces paled. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Then, someone stood up. A woman in the front row. I was 11 years old when my parents and brother died in that fire, she said. Her voice shook, but her eyes were sharp. And I always wondered why the fire department never told us the truth. Gallagher's jaw clenched. He stepped forward, reaching for the microphone, but she kept talking. You could have saved them, she said, looking at the old men in the front row, the ones who had been firefighters back then. You didn't, and you never admitted why. The room crackled with tension. Terrence turned to Gallagher. You want to celebrate 50 years of heroism? His voice was steady. Then let's celebrate the truth. Gallagher's face was white as a sheet, because he knew this town would never be the same again. Terrence Carter hadn't planned on staying in Willowbrook. After the banquet, after the truth had finally been spoken into the air of that stifling, smoke-tainted hall, he had driven away, his hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He told himself it was over. He had said his piece. The town could burn for all he cared. But then, the letter arrived. No return address, no name, just a single folded sheet of paper with 4 words written in shaky, uneven handwriting. There was another fire. Terrence should have ignored it. He should have thrown it in the trash, driven back to Chicago, and never looked back. But he didn't, because he knew something wasn't right. He parked his truck outside Main Street Diner, the same diner where he used to grab coffee before every shift, back when he still believed he was part of something good. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, the warm scent of grease and cheap coffee filling the air. Heads turned, eyes lingered. Some of them held guilt, others resentment. He took a seat at the counter. The waitress approached cautiously, her pen hovering over her notepad. Coffee? She nodded, but she didn't move. Her eyes flickered to the envelope still clenched in his hand. You got it? Terrence stiffened. You know who sent this? She glanced over her shoulder, lowered her voice. No, but I know what it's about. She set the coffee down and leaned in. It's happening again. Terrence's stomach tightened. What is? She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Fires. They've been suspicious. How many? 3, she whispered. All in the last 2 months. Terrence felt the weight of the past pressing against his chest. What's suspicious about them? She swallowed hard. Same thing every time. The first firefighters on the scene say it's too dangerous to go in. They hold back, let it burn. His grip tightened around the ceramic mug. And the victims? Her lips pressed into a thin line. No survivors. Terrence's pulse pounded in his ears. You think it's the same as before? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, Terrence sat in his truck, parked outside the charred remains of the latest house fire. The street was empty. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just the blackened skeleton of what was once someone's home. He stepped out, his boots crunching against the brittle debris, and moved toward the front door. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burnt wood and something else. Something metallic and sickly sweet. Terrence's jaw clenched. He had seen too many fires. He knew what burnt flesh smelled like. He moved cautiously through the wreckage, stepping over collapsed beams and shattered glass, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Then, a sound. Faint, unsteady, a whisper of movement from the far end of the room. Terrence froze. Someone was still here. He crept forward, muscles tense, scanning the ruins of the living room. And then he saw it. A boot print. Fresh. Leading deeper into the house. Someone had been here after the fire, or during it. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Then, a voice. Low, hoarse. You shouldn't have come back. Terrence spun, his flashlight flickering wildly over the darkness, but there was no one there. The room was empty. But the voice, he knew that voice. Warren Gallagher. The next morning, Terrence drove straight to the fire station. It looked the same as before. The red doors, the steel trucks, the same men who had once let him burn standing around with coffee in their hands, like nothing had changed. But something had changed. He had changed. He pushed through the doors. Every conversation died the second he stepped inside. He didn't care. "Where's Gallagher?" he demanded. No one answered. Terrence's gaze swept over the room, searching for the familiar, aging face of the man who had stood at that podium just a few nights ago, pretending to be a leader. But Gallagher wasn't there. "He's out on a call," one of the younger firefighters muttered. "House fire? On the west side?" Terrence didn't wait. He turned and bolted back to his truck, peeling out of the station lot, tires screeching against the pavement. Because he knew what was about to happen. Smoke billowed into the sky as Terrence pulled onto Maple Street. The house was already engulfed, flames licking at the roof like starving beasts. And just like before, no one was going in. The fire trucks stood still. Hoses lay untouched on the ground. The firefighters just stood there, watching, just like they had that night. Terrence slammed his door, storming toward them. "What the hell are you waiting for?" No one moved. Then, a voice behind him, low, even, familiar. "You don't go in for people who don't belong." Terrence turned. Warren Gallagher. He stood with his arms crossed, watching the flames rise. Not concerned, not worried, just watching. Terrence felt his breath hitch. "This is what you do," he whispered. "This is what you've been doing." Gallagher didn't answer. But he didn't have to, because the truth was right in front of him. Willowbrook's fire department had never been about protecting everyone. It had been about protecting certain people and letting the rest burn. The anger that had simmered inside Terrence for 15 years boiled over. He turned toward the house. "Carter, don't," Gallagher warned. Terrence ignored him. He grabbed the nearest hose, ripped it from the ground, and charged toward the flames. If no one else would go in, he would. The fire roared as he stepped through the threshold. Heat pressed against his skin. Smoke burned his lungs. But he pushed forward, scanning the burning wreckage. And then, the sound, the cry. Someone was alive. Terrence's heart pounded. He followed the sound, pushing through falling debris, his vision swimming. The heat was unbearable. His body screamed for him to turn back. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. Then he saw them. A woman and a child huddled beneath a collapsed beam, their faces streaked with soot and terror. Terence didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the child first, lifting them into his arms. Then the woman, one step at a time, one breath at a time. The flames closed in. The house groaned. And then a burst of light. The world tilted. Terence felt himself falling. The last thing he saw was the sky, dark with smoke, and Gallagher watching from the street, smiling. Then everything went black. When Terence woke up, he was in the hospital. Bandages covered his arms. His body ached with burns, but he was alive. So were the woman and the child. Gallagher, though, Gallagher was gone. The moment Terence went into that house, the man disappeared, because the truth was out now, and Willowbrook's fires had finally turned on the ones who set them. Elias Carter had always been a quiet man. He worked hard, kept to himself, and did everything by the book. That was the way his father had taught him, the way his grandfather had taught his father before him. Hard work, respect, patience. That was how a black man survived in America, even when the world wasn't fair. But patience had limits. Elias had lived in Crestwood, Georgia for 15 years. He had built his small auto repair shop from the ground up, fixing cars for people who barely gave him a second glance in the grocery store, but sure as hell came to him when their engine light came on. He didn't mind. Business was business. But he wasn't naive. He knew exactly what the town thought of him. Crestwood was old. It had history, the kind of history that was carved into the bones of the land, the kind people didn't talk about but still felt in the way eyes lingered too long and hands rested too easily on gun racks in pickup trucks. Elias ignored it. For years he ignored it, until the night he couldn't. It started with a call at midnight. The shop had been closed for hours, but the voice on the other end was desperate. A woman. Her truck had broken down on Route 17, out past the gas station. Elias hesitated. Nothing good ever happened on Route 17, but he grabbed his keys anyway. When he got there, the truck's hood was open, steam rising in the cool night air. The woman was standing next to it, arms wrapped around herself. Young, blonde, nervous. Elias pulled up, rolling his window down. "You called for help?" The woman hesitated. Her eyes darted past him, looking toward the trees. Something was wrong. "Ma'am?" Elias tried again. Before she could answer, headlights flooded the road. A second truck pulled up behind him. Then another. Doors slammed. Elias's grip tightened on the wheel. 4 men. White. Dressed in denim and boots. Faces set in that easy kind of arrogance that came with knowing you'd never have to answer for anything you did. The woman stepped away fast. She wasn't stranded. She was bait. Elias exhaled slowly. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Stay calm. Stay smart. Get home safe." The tallest of the men, Travis Holt, the sheriff's nephew, leaned against Elias's truck. "Well, look what we got here." Elias didn't answer. "You lost boy?" Travis asked, smiling. "No," Elias said, keeping his voice even. "Just helping out." Travis chuckled. "That right?" He turned to the woman. "Lindsay, this the guy?" The woman didn't answer, she just nodded. Elias's stomach turned. He didn't know what she had told them, but it didn't matter. He knew exactly how this story played out. Travis leaned in. "See, Lindsay here says you've been bothering her, following her home, calling her." Elias forced himself to stay still. "That's a lie." Travis's smile widened. "Yeah, well, I believe her." The second man stepped forward. Ricky Clark, mean, a drunk, the kind of man who only felt powerful when he was holding a bottle or someone's throat. "You know," Ricky said, cracking his knuckles. "My granddaddy used to tell me how they handled troublemakers like you back in the day." Elias swallowed. He had seen this before, in history books, in old photographs, in nightmares passed down like heirlooms. He glanced at the tree line, deep woods, no houses, no witnesses, no help. Travis sighed, shaking his head. "We gave you plenty of time to leave, Carter, but you just don't know when to quit." The third man, Clay Boone, reached for something behind his back. Elias saw the glint of metal. A gaunt, every muscle in his body locked. "Stay calm, stay smart, get home safe." Elias had never been a coward, but he wasn't a fool either. He knew when the odds were against him, and right now he was outnumbered, unarmed, and alone. He raised his hands. "I don't want trouble." Travis grinned. "Too late." The gun came up, and then another voice. "That's enough." The group turned. A figure stepped out of the trees. A man. Older, broad-shouldered, the kind of presence that made people listen when he spoke. Sheriff Cole. For a second, no one moved. Then Travis scoffed. "Come on, Uncle Cole, you know what he is." Sheriff Cole didn't answer. Instead, he walked forward, slow, steady, towered Elias. Then, past him. The sheriff stopped next to Travis, looked him in the eye. "Go home," he said. Travis blinked. "What?" "I said go home." Ricky frowned. "You serious?" Sheriff Cole's expression didn't change. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Clay hesitated. "Sheriff, don't repeat myself," Cole said. Silence. Elias stayed still, waiting. Then finally, Travis clicked his tongue. "Whatever." He turned, spat at Elias's feet, then walked back to his truck. One by one, the others followed. Engines roared, tires spun, headlights disappeared down the road, and just like that, they were gone. The sheriff didn't move. For a long moment, neither did Elias. Then Cole sighed. "You okay?" Elias exhaled. "I don't know." Cole nodded. "Yeah." Silence. Then Elias turned. "Why'd you help me?" Cole stared out at the empty road. "My father used to wear a badge too," he said quietly. "A long time ago, back when they called it keeping order." Elias swallowed. Cole's voice was tired. "You don't fix a town like this in a day, hell, maybe not in a lifetime, but you start somewhere." Elias studied him. "And where do you start?" Cole looked at him. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a set of keys, dropped them into Elias's hand. "The man fixing my brakes tomorrow?" Elias blinked. Then, slowly, he smiled. For the first time in a long time, maybe Crestwood wasn't ready to change. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to try. Elias Carter hadn't thought about leaving Crestwood for a long time. Not since the night Sheriff Cole stepped in, stopping what could have been a tragedy. That night changed things. Not the town itself. Crestwood was still Crestwood. But it changed how Elias saw it. For years he had told himself he was just a mechanic, just a man making an honest living, that if he worked hard and kept his head down, nothing would happen. That night shattered that illusion. He had seen it in their eyes. Travis Holt, Ricky Clark, Clay Boone. They weren't just angry. They were disappointed. Because they had wanted to do more. Elias had survived that night, but the question had haunted him ever since. What happens next time? It had been 6 months since then. 6 months of cautious peace, of a town that pretended nothing had happened. His shop still had customers, most of them the same people who barely met his eye at the grocery store, who still stiffened when he walked by. Sheriff Cole still brought his cruiser in for repairs, nodding to Elias like a man keeping a promise. For 6 months, Elias convinced himself he could live like this, until the call came. It was late. His shift had ended hours ago, but Elias was still in the shop, wiping oil from his hands when the phone rang. He hesitated before answering. Kerner's Auto. A pause, then, Elias? His stomach tightened. It was a woman's voice. Soft, shaken. He recognized it instantly. Lindsay? Another pause, a breath. Then, I need help. Elias gripped the phone. He hadn't seen Lindsay Holt since that night on Route 17, since she lured him into a trap. After everything, he had told himself he didn't hate her, but he didn't trust her either. And yet, what's wrong? He asked, a sharp inhale. I can't talk on the phone. Can you meet me? Elias didn't answer right away. He should have hung up, should have said no. But then she whispered, please. And just like that, he knew he was going. She was waiting behind the old gas station at the edge of town, wrapped in a thin coat, her blonde hair tangled. Her eyes darted toward the empty road as Elias pulled up. She looked scared. Elias stepped out of his truck, keeping his distance. What's this about? Lindsay swallowed. I need to leave town. Elliot frowned. That's not my problem. I know. Her voice was barely above a whisper. But it's about Travis. Elias stiffened. What about him? She hesitated, then, silence. Then, I don't want to be part of it. she continued, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to be part of anything, but after that night, after you, he's different. Worse. He won't let it go." Elias exhaled through his nose. He had known it. Deep down, he had known it was never over. Lindsay looked up at him, desperate. "He's planning something. He and Ricky. I don't know what, but I heard them talking. They want to make an example out of someone." Elias's blood turned cold. Lindsay's lips trembled. "You." Elias had always known Crestwood wasn't safe for him, but hearing it confirmed, hearing it laid out like that, like a death sentence, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. He drove home slowly, his fingers tight on the wheel, his mind racing. Leave. That was the only logical answer. But as his house came into view, he saw another car waiting outside. A sheriff's car. Sheriff Cole leaned against the hood, arms crossed. He didn't look surprised when Elias pulled up. "Long night?" Cole asked. Elias stepped out, locking eyes with him. "You already know, don't you?" Cole exhaled. "Yeah." "How bad is it?" Cole hesitated. "Bad." Elias studied him. "You trying to warn me?" Cole met his gaze. "I'm trying to tell you it's time to go." Elias nodded. He had expected that. But what he didn't expect was the next thing Cole said. "I'm leaving too." That made Elias pause. Cole sighed. "I tried. For years I tried. But this town, it's not changing." His voice was quiet but firm. "I won't be here next week." Elias processed that. He had always seen Cole as part of Crestwood, someone who walked the line between the law and the town's unspoken rules. But now, Cole was choosing to walk away. He had made his peace. Elias hadn't. Cole saw it in his eyes. "Don't do something stupid, Carter." Elias looked at his house, his shop, his town. Then he looked at Cole. "If I leave," Elias said, "who's next?" Cole exhaled. "That's not your fight." But it was, because it had always been. Elias didn't sleep. He sat on his porch, a shotgun resting across his lap, waiting. Midnight came, and so did the trucks. Engines roared down the dirt road. Headlights cut through the dark. They didn't come quietly. Travis Holt led them, standing in the bed of his truck like a king surveying his land. Ricky Clark sat beside him, a bottle in one hand, a rifle in the other. The others, 5, maybe 6 more, followed behind, trucks kicking up dust, cutting off any chance of escape. Elias rose slowly. Travis grinned. "Knew you wouldn't run, Carter." Elias didn't answer. Travis jumped down from the truck, hands in his pockets, casual as ever. "See, I got a problem. Sheriff's leaving, which means there's no one left to keep order." Elias's jaw tightened. Travis gestured around. "And this town, it doesn't belong to you." Elias took a step forward. "You sure about that?" Travis chuckled. "Oh, I'm sure." The others stepped forward, guns lifting. Elias's fingers flexed around his shotgun. But before anyone could move, a gunshot rang out. Not Elias's. Not Travis's. From the trees, a figure stepped into the headlights. Lindsay, holding a rifle. "Enough," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Travis's smile vanished. "You don't want to do this, Lindsay." "Yes, I do." The men hesitated. Travis's jaw clenched. "You think he's worth it?" Lindsay's eyes flickered to Elias, then back to Travis. "Well, I think I'm done letting you decide who's worth anything." Silence. Then, slowly, Travis lowered his gun, turned to the others. "Let's go." Ricky frowned. "You serious?" Travis didn't answer. One by one, the trucks backed up. Dirt kicked up. Engines faded. Then silence. Arius exhaled. Lindsay lowered the rifle. Elias looked at her. "Why'd you do that?" She didn't answer right away. Then, "Because you did it for me." Elias nodded. Maybe, just maybe, Crestwood wasn't done changing.